Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. I wanted to start a series about what is old growth, what makes a forest old growth. Something that I've thought about and where I live and where most of us are, unfortunately, old growth forests are increasingly rare. So I just wanted to kind of start a series and go to a few locations where we're looking at uh, an area of forest and kind of going through some of the criteria that makes it old growth and some of the things that maybe aren't. So this first section here will be in the Southern Alberta Foothills, eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, and it's a it's a bit of a dry, cold, and windy area as a whole. So even though we may have old growth for this area, it's kind of important to know that every type of ecosystem has kind of a climax or kind of a natural, um, you know, transition into a stable ecosystem. The eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, we have pioneer species such as lodgepole pine, aspen, balsam poplar that take hold quickly after a disturbance, such as a forest fire. And in the case of uh, far too many areas here, logging. Um, so it's just kind of like the difference between those transitions. What are the pressures in the ecosystem for kind of catastrophic change? In this area, through history, it would have been forest fires. Now we have forest fires combined with logging. Um, of course, human impacts are pretty much everywhere, so we have to kind of dismiss some of that. In this particular area, the human impacts would include people, hiking, biking, trails, these types of things, and cattle grazing and logging. So these little pockets that we're in now of more mature forest are pretty rare. This one, as you can see, is along a creek. So anyway, well, why don't we kind of go through some of the things that make a forest old growth and see how this area measures up. And what we'll do is this kind of area of more mature forest goes along this small creek, and there are a few other pockets, and we'll kind of go through these areas and see what what is and what isn't kind of an old growth feature. So first off, I guess what we can do is start by kind of going over what makes a forest old growth. So we have several different types of criteria. We have structural criteria, um, so uneven ages of the trees and the species. You're looking at, is it the dominant species, the shade tolerant dominant species? Meaning you can have mature lodgepole pine, but that doesn't necessarily mean that forest area would be kind of like considered old growth, as generally, if the forest would be undisturbed, shade tolerant species like subalpine fir and white spruce, Engelmann spruce in this area would slowly take over the lodgepole as they died. So in this area, do we see white spruce, fir, that type of thing? And the answer is yes. Those are the dominant species where we're standing here. And are there some trees approaching maximum age in the area? So we're standing right here beside a very large white spruce. This one is about 30 inches in diameter. I measured it with a diameter tape. And there are a lot of others upslope from the creek and down the creek. So I would say that in that regard, do we have mature, at least half half the age of the maximum, meaning 100 plus years for white spruce. And I would say definitely this area has that. And do we have standing dead and snags? And I would say that again, this area has that. We can see we have a spruce, some dead spruce there through those trees. And another criteria as well is fallen coarse woody debris, and we can see a lot of that of various ages here. And some of those, like this area was subject to quite a bit of windfall recently, but those are the kinds of things that open the canopy, such as the area that I'm standing here, and we have some pioneer species in those openings. So that's kind of what part of what makes a patch growth or patchwork old growth forest. So, and another criteria being, is there natural regeneration of the species? And we see young and old of spruce of all ages here, and we see young aspen and poplar and alder, and we are actually in spring here, so a lot of the undergrowth still hasn't come up yet, but it's just starting to. We can kind of see here we have small gooseberry or blackcurrant here coming up, various grasses. This is a relatively open spot because the creek is a little bit gets a little bit swampy here. So another feature would be what kind of inhabitants are here, and there's a lot of bear sign here. So we have kind of apex species, as well as all the usual suspects in the Rocky Mountains. There's porcupine, there's skunks, there's all those types of rabbits, all those types of species here. So there's a lot of features here that that would be considered old growth, and there's a few features that wouldn't be. So one of those is there minimal human disturbance? And in this area I would say no, because we do have cattle grazing here. This is a heavily used recreation area, so I would say that this is has a fairly heavy human footprint in this area. But I would say that also this is well on its way to becoming an old growth area. We can maybe call it a mature area at this point. This area has kind of a wildfire frequency. The studies that I've read in the subalpine, between 320 years to, in these lower valleys, up to 90 years. So that kind of forest fire frequency, it's hard to say. You would either be on the edge of having an old growth area that burns every 90 to 100 years, or you would be looking at quite a bit longer, where in between burns in an area like this, where maybe it's there's enough moisture and humidity, and where the fires don't necessarily get it. So anyway, we'll go on to a couple more areas along the creek here, and then move off to some other kind of type of habitats, and just kind of see how they measure up as well. Okay, we're at another section just upstream from where our last area was, and this is a great example of how old growth forests become kind of that patchwork type habitat. And here we have some mature white spruce that has gone over, and another feature of an old growth forest will be those kind of I guess some people call them pillows and cradles, or kind of the piles and divots that are associated with when a tree goes over. I'll just get around this aspen here. The roots pull up the soil, and that soil eventually drops down as the root ball and stump rot, and we get kind of like a pile and then a divot where that soil was removed. And so this kind of serves as a feature to help water go into the ground. There's all sorts of kind of benefits to that, and it's definitely a feature of a mature or older growth forest. So we see quite a bit of wind damage here, but it is, in the grand scheme of things, quite a localized area. So this will colonize with some pioneer species. There's already some smaller white spruce that are in here that will also benefit. So and this area has new snags, that are up here. You can see kind of angled here. These are less than a year old, and the one that's there, and those will become those kind of standing dead trees that are so valuable to certain members of the, or members, I guess, animals that make a living out here, like woodpeckers and all sorts of mammals that would eat the insects that grow in there, and use those trees for shelter and all that type of thing. So we see that we can see here a poplar, a balsam poplar, also in the creek here. And that's another sign of a old growth area where you have a creek and lots of wood or woody debris in that creek, shading it, cooling it, and you can actually still see a little bit of ice under that tree. So you can see it definitely cools. On another piece there, definitely cools the area, having that kind of woody debris over top. And you can see there's a interesting pattern on the wood of the balsam poplar after the bark has come off. It's kind of neat, a neat way you can tell it's balsam poplar. And we have a very old kind of rotting log here right in front of us, and this could have been, that could be a century old. In this environment, it takes a little longer for the spruce to decompose. It's not as wet as some areas, and of course it's frozen along 6 months of the year, so that certainly slows it down. But definitely kind of an interesting start to one of those I guess openings that kind of make an old growth forest so interesting, with so much different habitat. Okay, I stopped in this area here. It's another blowdown section, but there's something kind of interesting here, because even though the aspen, the trembling aspen, is pioneer species, if left undisturbed on a good site, like obviously this one is, as there's large trees all around. Some unfortunately have blown down, but there are supporting a lot of large trees. But if left undisturbed by fire and those types of things, they can get quite large. This particular one at the bottom is almost 26 inches that I've measured around diameter, and it's quite tall, but not as tall as you might expect. It has a very interesting pattern of injury. You can see it kind of spiral up, and that spiral shows you the direction of growth. The trees kind of spiral up as they grow, and that old wound, maybe, it could have even been lightning or something like that, but this tree has survived, and it's probably towards the end of its life, but it's probably a longer living tree. And there's several here. Here's another one, a little bit smaller, and two at the back that are a little bit smaller yet. But this particular one is likely as old as some of the spruce here, maybe at the end of its lifespan, maybe 80 years or something like that. But it's quite fascinating to see how big these grow on favorable sites. And you see it's This is the north side of the tree. It's covered in moss. It's right next to the creek where its roots have essentially limitless water. But yet another kind of interesting area in a mature forest like this. And you see we have soon to be dead snags. We have all the ingredients here. If this area is left undisturbed, which maybe it will be, being kind of close to human settlements and where people live, I believe that the forest fires will be pretty aggressively put out in this area. So maybe it'll give this area a chance to become true old growth, if it can avoid being logged, that is. But we'll also take a look at some varying stages of logged areas and how they differ and how much more valuable to us as people and the ecosystem in general these areas of mature, diverse forests are. And you can just see, looking through this area, there's all sorts of things going on. And when we do look at some areas that are logged, and we'll do that in a little bit more detail later on in the kind of the series, it's just not the same, and it won't be for a very long time, especially if they're on a cycle, 60-year, even 80-year cycle. It certainly won't reach this type of forest. I have to believe is over 100 years in the making in this part of Alberta. So anytime we see this kind of go down, we're in our lifetimes, we're not going to see it again, which is really unfortunate. So something to think about. But we'll keep moving on here and see what else we can find. Okay, just a quick segment here on just kind of you can see the value of some of this dead wood that is lying on the forest floor here. So right here you can see a lot of holes as animals such as woodpeckers are digging for food. They provide nesting sites, these types of things. And here again, something as completely open this rotted log up, possibly looking for food, for ants or who knows, grubs, those types of things. So just a kind of a really good spot where you can see how valuable this stuff is. So clearing out all the dead wood in a forest, well, it does help prevent some forest fire issues. There is a cost ecologically, so just something to think about. There's obviously, you have to do a kind of a guess on which is the more important thing at the time. Sometimes a fire going through this area would be pretty devastating, but that's kind of how things work. So okay, here's another area here of interest, and as we had stated before, one of the criteria of an old growth forest is trees at the end of their kind of maximum life, and these would be the climax trees towards the end of their maximum life. And this one here is a spruce, quite tall, likely over 100 feet, which in this area is a tall tree. Certainly wouldn't be in other areas, but here it is. But this tree certainly would be towards the end of its life. And as you can see here, it's quite a large tree. I haven't measured it, but it would be well into the 30-inch diameter range. And you can see the woodpeckers have been seeking out larvae and whatever else they can find in the bark. But it's definitely a sign that this tree is starting to decline, as well as you can see There's no needles until at least 80 feet in the air here. So 75% of this tree is free of kind of foliage. So, and well, you can see, looks like a moth over here, and it's surrounded by large trees and snags and dead snags of different ages, wood on the ground. So this area certainly has a lot of characteristics that would be considered old growth. So very, very kind of telling that this forest is quite old. Okay, here's another sign of an old forest here, and you can see along the same creek there's a lot of woody debris there, and we come across and we see this very large spruce next to some very large aspens, and these are similar size to the ones we saw, but these now are standing deadwood, and we have a lot of fungal activity on the trunks, which likely started prior to their death. But just kind of interesting to see that in not so long a time, those ones that we saw downstream there will kind of end up this way. But they don't stop serving kind of the forest community when they die. As you can see, there's still a lot going on. So interesting area. There's a lot of lichen growth on the lower branches of the spruce, a lot of moss and lichen growth on the aspen bark, and kind of another sign we are in either in an old growth area, or what would be considered in this zone, or a very close to becoming an old growth area if just catastrophic disturbances don't happen. So okay, we've kind of entered a spot where we have much less species diversity on the ground. It's mostly a mossy kind of ground cover, and it's very rough and wet, and you can see that these are all kind of fallen trees that are now covered in moss, and in between you get these kind of depressions where it goes right down to kind of the soil. Just kind of another interesting aspect here. It's a little more even aged, a little younger, but possibly still fairly old. Maybe this area was subject to kind of a large disturbance in the past, being with so much apparent kind of woody debris under the moss. So this kind of area is a little bit interesting. We'll kind of see what we can see here to determine what we're, how old, and if there's kind of any other clues. As you can see, the ground kind of rises to a higher point. We'll head up that way next and kind of see what we can see up there. Okay, so we've gained about 100 meters elevation from the stream bottom where we were, and this is transitioned into a very different type of forest. This is kind of a lodgepole spruce mix, and you see the undergrowth with the increased sunshine, and it's a little drier, is it's a little more open here, is kind of more grassy. So, but what is interesting is there's still some very large trees up here. So this particular one looks quite unassuming. Measured it at just over 34-inch diameter, which is just under a meter, and that's a very large white spruce, and there's several up here like that. So this area here still shows, even though it's a very different type of forest, still shows a lot of old growth type indicators. And there's the lodgepole up here. There's some very big ones that tells me that they're fairly old as well. And I'm not sure how the the obvious more this is a drier area affects the growth on a tree like this. As a it's hard to say how much moisture it gets here as compared to the ones at the stream banks, but certainly less. And maybe that actually would make these a little bit older for a similar size. But some of the biggest trees in the area are up on this hill. So, and this is north facing, so it doesn't get blasted with sun, holds a little more snow in the winter. That's probably a factor, but very interesting nonetheless. As it opens up, there's still a lot of kind of old growth characteristics, and it's mixed with more I guess you'd call it pioneer species, but it still shows a lot of signs of being fairly old forest. Here's another kind of interesting area to highlight here. So I guess what we want to look at here is, even though this area has some old trees and some old growth characteristics, it can still include open areas like this, these meadows. And this particular one is full of berries and ferns, young ferns. You can hear my dogs walking around. I apologize for that. But just the diversity of life in these areas is really quite impressive. So it's not necessarily disturbed by fire or logging in the recent past, and what we have is kind of a great diversity of things that grow from the dense parts of the forest to these openings where we have alder and berries and ferns and Solomon seal or false Solomon seal and all these types of things. So it's all these areas working together, I think, that makes kind of a that diverse web where the species diversity in each area kind of happens. So really interesting. Okay, so I kind of want to end the video here where we have kind of a transition of that open, older, mature forest that we've been walking through, where it transitions here to what was a clear cut. And this area looks to be 25 to 30 years old. Some of the trees, maybe 20. They're growing very densely, and I'm not really sure if they were planted. Probably not. They're pretty dense, or if it was just part of the kind of the seed bank that's in the soil. It's it's a stark difference, I guess, between the two. What we have from the mature forest here, where you can see there's a diversity of life in this area. As we've kind of been walking through, we've looked at large trees, the openness in this particular hillside allows for a lot of sun and a lot of kind of sun-loving plants to be growing. And we move over to here, and we're not even able to walk through here. It's so dense, and it's a very different type of forest, if you want to even call it a forest. So just something to think about, where there are trees growing there. That's good. Eventually it'll thin itself, and if left to its own devices will become like the forest behind us. But it's going to be many decades before that happens, and something that we all should kind of be concerned with, that we want to keep a few areas here like the one that we've been walking through of mature or old growth, depending on how you look at it. I would consider this area to be kind of old growth for the Southern Alberta Foothills, in the sense that there's very few other areas that would be more mature than this. I'll certainly be looking for them and showing you guys. And the other thing is, we want to make sure that we're not really comparing areas. This area clearly is very different than, say, the west coast of Vancouver Island. The ancient forests, the remnants of ancient forests that are left there are incredible, and it's very different from this. So you can't really compare, or like some of the remnants of the Carolinian type forests in the eastern Canada and US. Those are spectacular in their own right, but you just have to look at each one individually. And every ecosystem has kind of a climax or an old growth form, and each of them should be appreciated in their own right. So, and the reason why I chose this section is it didn't show any evidence of logging, and hasn't seen a fire in quite some time. So I think that this we can consider to be a Southern Alberta Foothills climax forest, and it's just an incredible place. So thank you, and we'll look at some more areas. I hope to get to a whole bunch of different ecosystems and look at whether it's old growth or not. You can probably come up with reasons why this isn't, but I think there's more reasons why it is, especially some of that valley bottom areas that we went through. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.